ones.
Just hang out.
Okay.
Yeah, just hang out in the crowd.
Well, we might be working with you sometime on this. All inclusive. March 19th meeting of the Historical Preservation Board to order, and this is going to be a study session, so we won't have any public comment, but we have some interest, hopefully in the Littleton corridor, so we'll hear a presentation and some discussion on where we go from here. I don't think anything is going to be set in stone, but we can get the process started. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Andrea.
Okay, so tonight we have arranged to have our consultants, Diane Ray Tomaso and Michael Paglia, come and discuss the Littleton Boulevard survey with the board. This is one of the pieces of the contract that the city has with the state for the overall project. And I think most of you were at the presentation at Bemis. And so this one, you will have more opportunity to ask questions, get to a little more detail. And then I think Diane and Michael may have some ideas about future projects that they will be recommending. And by the way, a recommendation of future projects is a component of every survey that we do through the state. So next time we go for a grant application, if we can say, well, it was recommended by our historic preservation professionals, that gives it a lot more weight for our next grant round. So that's how that works. So Michael and Diane, if you'd like to come up and get started.
Should we lower the lights a little so the pictures look better?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, yikes. And the coincidence of the lights dimming, I thought I had disconnected the room. Oh, maybe I'll probably block. I'll be over here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So this varies a little bit from the Bemis presentation in that we've consolidated it down to the Tier 1 buildings in the survey. As we explained at that meeting, although we're doing intensive and reconnaissance level surveys for the project, we're also trying to create a survey and a survey document that are going to help you guys use this actively in terms of beginning to think about preservation, what kind of public outreach you're going to be involved with, that this can be a document that hopefully has interest to the general public as it's submitted to you, instead of something that needs to then be transformed into an outreach document. So we're going to initially look at the buildings and look at the area involved, and then as we get to the end of the document, I also have organized a number of spreads from the actual submission document, so you can see the type of presentation we're going to be doing with this, and then we'll also have some conversation about public outreach and how we think that could work.
And let me just jump on what Diane said. Part of this process is the satisfying the state's interests in surveying these buildings, and those are like survey forms. So that is something that we're not dealing with in this presentation. This presentation could almost function like a book, and could, for the public, that has all the information that you would normally find in this kind of bureaucratic world, which is very unfriendly to ordinary people. And so we tried to make this friendly, visually friendly, and easy to understand.
Lots of pictures.
Lots of pictures. Yes.
Yeah.
So yes, historic modern architecture of the Greater West Littleton Boulevard corridor, 1950 to 1980. So that's the historic context and the geographic area that we're looking at.
So this map shows you how we're defining that corridor. The left-hand section to the west of the tracks, we're calling the Main Street corridor, and we're picking up buildings related to the period from 1950 to 1980 that were actually built in the historic district area downtown. And then moving to the east, show the buildings marked in red that are directly on West Littleton Boulevard with West Littleton Boulevard addresses. And then we go 2 blocks to the north or south and pick up buildings that we define as being part of the West Littleton Boulevard corridor. That is not directly on the street, but commercial development obviously spawned by West Littleton Boulevard development. And a little bit further along, when we look at the actual pages out of the survey document, there'll be a map that actually has those areas highlighted to make that even a little more clear.
And also just the physical encountering of the space, which you all know very well, that it has this reality that runs for those kind of 2 blocks north and south, where this commercial development happened within a very limited amount of time. And the only violations to that would be down on Santa Fe or up on South Broadway, where you're actually encountering other kinds of development coming and intersecting Old Littleton.
Diane,
Yes,
are all the buildings that we surveyed commercial?
yes.
That was our charge.
Yes.
We were charged with just looking at commercial buildings, so we didn't do apartment buildings, and we didn't do residences, even though, and there's churches too, that would be in this area, just buildings built to be professional buildings, banks, stores, restaurants, that kind of thing.
And the one soft part of that is it also includes a small number of residential buildings that were altered by modern additions and were converted to commercial structures.
And those are on the lowest tier.
So not like some of the arts and crafts one where the building remained intact as it was originally, but where modern additions had been made. So we're going to start down in old downtown, since that's the way we normally experience it, coming out of downtown, going up the hill, crossing the tracks, coming to the courthouse, and then beginning to move eastward along West Littleton Boulevard.
And that also reflects the development pattern, where the West End, for the most part, had the earliest development, and the East End had the later. That's not completely true, because there are exceptions, but sort of a tendency.
Yeah, it was pretty much a linear development, although different dates do move back and forth east to west. So this is the first of the buildings downtown. I'm going to call it Van Schack, or I believe everyone here calls it Van Schack.
Scott.
Van Schack. Okay.
Okay, now we have our third possibility to confuse me still further. And this is a lovely building, fine materials, filled travertine, granite detailing, very elegant, designed to fit very neatly within the historic street plan, and yet took that corner also for parking. So it kind of represents a hybrid of modernist and old downtown site planning, but with a modern building.
Yeah, there's just a few things I want to point out about this building, because I think it's easy to ignore this building because it's so incredibly plain. But as Diane was saying, these are filled travertine panels with this beautiful vertical line setting against the predominating horizontal. And that same rhythm is picked up in the corner detail of the door and in this window on the side. A really interesting and subtle feature of the building is it's built on a fancy granite podium. So that this is a very fancy cut of granite with the setback, the recessed area you can see here where it's set back next to the building next door with this travertine. Interestingly enough, in examining it, this granite podium is on this side too. It's just been buried behind a curb that they've added. Now, we've been told that this building is perhaps going to be remodeled, rehabbed, and it's so simple that it's very easy to destroy whatever it is that makes this, that gives this any character at all. Also, I would point out the cantilevered boxed eaves that shelter the outline of the podium. You go the next.
Littleton University of Hair Design. This is a very interesting little architectural composition with deep overhanging eaves, exposed structural elements in the extended beams here, coming out here, running all along here, exposed, the detailing, the fascia here, the way that these vertical elements along these areas here are all positioned and raised. Beautiful glass corner, and then a deck functions beautifully for what it is.
Right, I was going to say this glass lantern against this wraparound horizontal, a two-part horizontal box with this lantern at the corner. And this is a building, you know, despite the butterfly on the side, this is a building that virtually is unchanged from when it was new, and yet has a new use. It's a very hip kind of coffee shop. It has a really nice, sophisticated vibe to the design, and this very small scale. It's like a little jewel box building.
And obviously the tenants picked up on the remarkable qualities of this building and amplified them and played off them in bringing their business here.
This is a Cook's Pharmacy. It's now, what is it?
Pet food. Pet store.
Yeah, but what's the name of it? It's got a funny kind of name.
Lewis and Bark.
Lewis and Bark, that's right. This is a very simple but very sophisticated building. And just to point out a few things. Okay, you have a similar, on the cantilevered eave, the fascia, similarly detailed with the kind of, you know, impressions coming out. Take a look at this thing. Okay, first you have this wing wall here that defines a front porch with the cantilevered eave over it. Then you have the suggestion of a clear story in the top of the show windows that runs to the transom over here, and then to a real clear story that runs all the way down the side of the building. This was you know, you can, I guess the buildings that we identified as having the top tier, it was clear that they were the work of an intelligent architect, even if we couldn't find out who the architect was, which is the case with Van Schok, with Cook's Pharmacy, and with the University of Hair Design. We were unable to find out who did those buildings.
Circle Savings and Loan is a beautiful building, and I have just found a historic shot of this that shows it from above too, so it gives you a sense that will be added to the document, gives a sense of the overall massing of the building, very unusual by Laramie and Butts, and this is in good condition, painted unfortunately, but there's a really remarkable plan, landscape plan. There's a dropped courtyard at this end of the building, so these windows and a matching row of windows below are actually looking out over an internal courtyard.
The parking has been hidden behind the building and landscape features, so that it, unlike, say, Cook's Pharmacy, where it was right out front, or the Van Schok, that here it was part of the plan of Laramie and Butts. And I think this is one of the absolute finest buildings in Old Littleton from this period, is this bank.
As you see, we're talking about parking, the relationship of parking to the building, and clearly one of the major changes that took place historically during the period was the integration of the automobile with architecture. So what we bring up in relationship to all these buildings is how the building plans and site planning of the street vary dramatically from old downtown, and whether the parking reflects a welcoming to retail customers, or whether it's a professional building or a banking building, which would have been seen as a level of building where the parking would have been hidden to the rear. Those kinds of relationships between the buildings and the parking lots become really important here.
And also something to think about is this is a period in which a surface parking lot was a plus. You know, even though today we decry their appearance, but I think that's why some of these buildings have asphalt forecourts, was because that was, you know, space age. That was, you know, up to the minute. You could park right there. You didn't have to park on the street the way you did downtown. And this is a little aside, but we've thought there could be something related to landscaping suggestions about how to make some of these parking lots work a little better with the streetscape, say like a border plantings or something like that, which they, in their day, they wouldn't want to do because they wouldn't want to hide their business from the thoroughfare. But today we have a different attitude about that.
And that would be a nice way to create a different contemporary feeling for the street, enhance the buildings, enhance the greenery and so forth in a way that doesn't disturb the buildings themselves. The last downtown building is Barker Winter CCAS Littleton National Bank. This is an interesting building in that it fits really from this angle, looking from Main Street over to Alamo. It fits very much within the conservative early 20th century streetscape of downtown, but then the back of the building completely with a large parking lot. This tower was originally had 4 clock faces and included a carillon that played music a couple of times a day. Barker Rinker Seacat was very active during this period, and they're an important firm. One of their other big projects was Larimer Square.
Writer Square.
Oh, pardon me, Writer Square.
Writer Square. I was going to say a couple things. They did several of these smaller banks during this period, and there's one in a very similar one in Cherry Creek North, but this one is nicer, and this one has more, is sited better. The tower is a more deluxe than in the other one. Also, the kind of whiskey-colored brick, the one in Cherry Creek North is just common red brick.
It's a beautiful masonry.
And this is a brutalist-style building with that slit window and the deep overhang of the second floor to the recessed back floor, bottom floor.
And here we've moved up the ridge and starting to look at buildings on West Littleton Boulevard proper. And of course, the first one that you really encounter in Tier 1 is Sternberg's Courthouse Building. Fortunately, we had done a evaluation of significance on this building when it was threatened with demolition, and we're able through that. The city really worked hard, and we got a sympathetic owner for the building, and it's been saved and looks wonderful. Remains a beautiful addition to the street. Expressionist building with this dramatic, jagged, folded plate roof line. These panels of a really handsome gray brick contrasting with stacked bond white glazed brick panels here. And of course this building was the offices for Eugene Sternberg Associates and for Marty Miller, attorney and one-time attorney general, or not attorney general, attorney for the Arapahoe County.
Let me just also say, you're talking about the beautiful masonry. This building, like the Circle Savings and Loan and the Littleton National Bank, express the highest standard of construction craft for this period. You know, all the buildings in Tier 1 are well built, but some of these are built as finely as anything was built at that time, which means better than now.
The other thing that this represents, the parking that we talked about is a professional building, which is not in front of the building. The building's positioned at the street, very dignified way. The parking's around the 2 sides to it, and also beautifully and dramatically integrated with the landscape. The building proper, the upper 2 stories, were intended as professional offices, but there was originally a pharmacy retail space down here. And as you come off the sidewalk down here, you walk along a recessed sidewalk that goes deeper and deeper behind this wall and then comes to that pedestrian door. So you have this interesting sunken entry to the building that's enhanced by landscaping and masonry.
I have a question about the gray brick masonry. Why is it modeled like that? Have bricks been replaced, or what's the story?
No, I don't think so. I think it's just natural variations in the brick, but I'll take a closer look at it the next time I'm there.
That's what I thought too. I thought it was just the way the brick differs.
And I would love to see a smaller sign here, although there was originally a sign, you know, to have one that's a little bit smaller, but I don't think it interferes too much with the character of the building. Then we have title guarantee. Marlowes. And Joseph and Louise Marlowe are interesting in that, you know, they were a married couple, both trained, educated architects. Louise's father was heavily involved with the construction industry here in town. They met at Washington U in St. Louis, where they were both studying. And
the premier Miesian architects working in this part of the country. This would be as fine an example of Miesian architecture in Colorado as I can imagine. The Joshel House, which has a historic preservation easement maintained by Historic Denver and the fund, the
Colorado Preservation.
the historic fund.
Historical Fund.
The Colorado Historical Fund, this is on Hilltop, is closely related to this, except this is better and about 3 times bigger than the Joshel House. And that's Joshel, and you can look it up on Google.
And of course, the magnificent mural.
Yes.
Anything else?
No.
Oh, I'll also say this has some integral landscaping feature over here running along the side, set back behind this generous courtyard, which leaves the space for this pretty important landscaping areas here. And again, as a professional building, the parking set behind it off the street.
And this is a building that the more you look at it, the more amazingly beautiful the details are and how thoughtful it is.
Gene Sternberg's Miller Building. This was built for after the county asked them to take over the courthouse building for county offices. Gene moved his office and then designed this building for Marty Miller's office. It's here, magnificent condition, absolutely beautiful, brutalist.
Closely related to his much larger Arapahoe Community College Commission,
And Heritage High
which
School.
is just about a year before. This is about a year before the community college. Yeah, this is. If you don't know this building well, work your way around it. The sculptural handling of the rear staircase, you know, is just breathtaking. The exterior. Express exterior staircase.
And then a major landscape feature here, where this used to be a very severe kind of formal fountain. It's since been informalized by more native plantings and informal arrangements of stone, but that where you climb this staircase over the water feature to enter the building or enter behind it from the side. This building, as well as the Gene's other brutalist buildings in Littleton, really form one of the best concentrations of highest level brutalism in the state of Colorado.
Yeah, and also just notice that exaggerated overhanging cantilevered eave, you know, with the huge frieze across the front of the cast concrete.
Professional building with the parking lot to the side and rear.
This is the Littleton Medical Center East, and it was part of the complex where just to the south was Sternberg's Littleton Medical Clinic. This building was done by Richard Crowther. Crowther was a pioneer in modern architecture in the Denver area. Some of you who've been around here for a long time may remember the Cooper Theater on Colorado, what do they call that, Cinerama Theater? That was his work. His own home, which is a laboratory to look at alternative energy and solar and green functions, still stands in Cherry Creek North. Most of his commissions are in Cherry Creek North. But this has been resurfaced with brick. Partially resurfaced with brick. See, if we look back here, this would have been the original surfacing, and they covered it with this brick, and they put this gewgaw over the door and another one over there. But basically the form of the building and the handling of the fenestration is just as it was when it was built in 1966. So a future owner could elect perhaps to take the brick off and return it to the stucco that it was, which strikes me as a very easy fix.
And let's say, this brings up the issue of integrity, which is something that, of course, is important to the state's survey program. And we discuss integrity at some length in the document. And I will say that we are going to have some conflicts with the state over the issue of integrity, specifically on this building. They're already making noises like they don't feel it has enough integrity. We 1,000% stand behind this as a rare work of Crowther's, as an important building in the community. And, you know, we foresee that we, as we move on with this process, are going to begin having conversations about integrity, how we feel about integrity at a local level, at a Littleton level. And those may not be entirely in concert with the state's evaluation.
One thing that we've thought was, imagine this is a 19th century building and someone has followed the exact shape of the windows and walls and put red brick across it where it was stucco. Would that disqualify a 19th century building from preservation? It wouldn't. And so we feel like that's the same model that we should use. And, you know, to get on, to further what Diane was saying, a number of the buildings that we surveyed wound up on the bottom two tiers because we felt they lost their integrity. So we're not saying that we're accepting of all changes that happen to buildings, but we feel that since the form of this building is the same as when it was new, since the fenestration is the same, that what we're dealing with is some surface details and some added canopies, that it's just not enough to have. If somebody had put a Swiss chalet roof on it, you know, it was going to be a fourth tier building. So
it's also the only surviving member of a larger medical complex that was extremely important to the history of architecture and healthcare in Littleton.
And as far as we know, the only surviving Crowther in Littleton, because he also did the shopping center at the southwest corner of Littleton Boulevard and Broadway that we found photographs of, but that has long since disappeared.
The original King
Superstore. It had like a tower, and there's even a beautiful, the library which has all of Crowther's papers and photos and everything, beautiful slides of the original like produce section and what have you, and it's all very mid-century modern, very space-agey. And it was an extremely beautiful shopping center. It's long since, I don't remember having seen it.
It's probably on its
What
third or fourth version.
What are the ramifications, if any, that you disagree with the state?
Well, what it is the only ramification of it is, okay, you guys, as far as we can tell, don't have that same level of fanaticism about integrity, so that a lot of the buildings on Main Street have had minor changes made, but are still warranted to be saved. What Diane's talking about is, if we wanted to have this listed on the National Register for architecture, we would have a struggle with getting it on the National Register. Not that, you know, it's certainly in local historic districts. That's not the problem, typically.
That would preclude the building from getting federal tax credits for historic preservation. However, if it's incorporated into a local district or listed locally, it becomes eligible for state tax credits and state grants.
And also in our research, you know, we haven't gotten to our recommendations yet, but in our research, we found something called the documentation, the
Colfax. There are different types of federal districts that rely more on historical approaches that recognize the speed at which commercial buildings are redeveloped and reused, that not only time-wise, of course, development's moving faster and faster, but also that the types of changes that are commonly made by retailers and commercial buildings are not said to preclude the significance of the buildings in these types of districts. They recognize the fact that these buildings were designed to evolve as commercial structures as tenants change.
Okay, and why I was, it's called a National Register multiple property documentation. So in that system, it would be eligible for National Register listing in the context of this multiple property documentation device that accounts for changes that are made that don't substantially change the character of the building. So basically what we're saying is, and maybe this is a little arcane to have discussed it, but that as an individual landmark, it would be very hard to do. But as part of this different approach called a National Register multiple property documentation, it could be listed on the National Register. And I almost felt like you guys have your own rules that, from as far as we can tell, and are not constrained by that kind of it can't be a district, it has to be a documentation, it can't be, I don't think you guys have that in your ordinance.
I think it's also important to say how advanced the city of Littleton is in terms of preservation, the long-time focus that it's had on history and survey and preservation, and that in some ways you're running ahead of the pack of most communities in terms of looking at this period of architecture, first of all, but also in terms of being innovative in terms of approaches about how you can help building owners, how you can guide a process where a historic designation becomes an advantage to owners and so forth. It's just not, it can't be listed on the National Register, so it doesn't mean anything. Or it doesn't have enough integrity to be on the National Register. You guys have your own standards for what is valuable, and there's a number of buildings that we'll see in here and in Tier 2 as well that are beloved and valued by this community, such as the Safeway, for example, the old Safeway building that would, really not meet standards for National Register listing.
In terms of national listing and federal tax credits for the owner, it would be difficult, but not impossible.
No, in fact, Diane has worked personally. We've both worked on a number of projects that were declared out of the gate ineligible that we got listed. And Diane, more recently, the Middleton Building in downtown Denver. We haven't gotten. I feel like we're jumping ahead, but there's a synergy here, so I want to keep doing it. Do you guys know the downtown district in downtown Denver, the commercial district, which is an overlay district, meaning the buildings are not adjacent to one another? That they're non-contiguous buildings. That was a suggestion we wanted to make to you all when we get finished with this, is the idea of this non-contiguous overlay district in which buildings qualify because of their original purpose and because of their architectural design. So it both has the history of the rise of post-war Littleton and the rise of modernist architecture. Which Littleton is really an awfully small city to have had this many interesting top-tier buildings.
And some of that relates to being the county seat.
And also being so close to Denver. You have Sternberg lived here. What's his name? Earl Chester Morris lived here. So you have important architects living down here and becoming involved, just like Benedict did, in the early 20th century.
So I'm looking at the clock now, and I'm making an executive decision that we need to move forward. Clearly, Michael and I can talk about this for hours on end, and two, that's actually what we do. We want to move through the rest of these and leave room for discussion at the end too, so we can focus on your concerns. And we're coming up on some duplicate architects too. The Mr. Steak restaurant that was originally intended as a template, a design template for future restaurants, but that never happened. So this was the only version of Mr. Steak that was built in this manner, and all other ones
are much more conservative, mundane design that was adopted after this was a non-starter as a prototype.
This is a very well cared for building, and the owners are very fond of it as well. Mountain States Telephone and Telegraph, Temple Buell, you know, one of the gods of mid-century architecture in Denver. A beautiful building.
And it so sensitively relates to the Benedict Church next door. I was noticing that as we came down tonight, about how the massing and the setback and everything just takes so much into account from the church.
A industrial building for all practical purposes, but built to the highest standard of design and craft, and basically presented as a professional building in a grouping of professionals.
Right, this is a switching station that Buell designed as though it were an office building. And there's so, go back for 1 second, there's a lot, and then we'll race ahead.
No,
But, you can't?
No.
Okay, you skipped one. No. My fault. I was going to point out that you're going forward again. The aggregate, it alternates polish and roughed aggregate on the...
Yeah, the detailing on it is very fine.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Can you get it to full screen?
Yes, dear. Bottom right.
There you got it. But the aggregate that's used is alternated, polished, and rough. There's outdoor furniture that matches. There's that bench. There's a planter. The way that the frieze below the roof line is recessed, and then the flat plane of the roof seeming to float above the rest of the building.
Yeah, and these boxes beneath the boxed canopies are planter boxes as well. So there's really a whole very formal landscape design in front of this building that's not immediately apparent when you're just driving by. So we're going to start moving quickly through these. Wyndemere Family Dentistry, would love to know who did this. We're probably going to go to the family.
And see if there's any record. Well, doing our research, which you all probably know, doing research on Littleton, is that there's very little information from the city, and the Littleton Independent provides very little information. So we felt like we were lucky to find out what we did. Another Joseph and Louise Marlowe building. The sunscreen is by Robert Probst, who later went on to become nationally famous as a designer.
This originally had a very formally landscaped front and rear courtyard by Jane Silverstone Reese, who's one of the most important landscape architects from the period.
A sculpture by Probst.
And a sculpture that stood in front by Probst, and we were able to get some historic photos of the landscape from her archives at the Denver Public Library. Taco House, richest charcoal burgers, Googie.
Yeah, a rare example of Googie style. A rare example of this kind of expressionist architecture from mid-century that hasn't been altered. Because it would be so easy to update a building like this. Behind those concrete screens is the drive-through feature, which is something we're seeing for the first time in buildings from this period, is the idea of drive-up, pick-up, delivery.
Yeah, and that was true of the previous bank as well. And this is a bank just south of Taco House, an extremely important bank by Earl Chester Morris. It's been painted inappropriately recently, but still retains all of its massing and details.
Yeah, it was sad that it was painted because it was a green and white pebbly aggregate in casting, which it still is, but they, the color must have looked wrong to the church that has it now, and they painted it this beige during the course of the survey. The painting happened.
This was an interesting building, the FranCam Building from '74, designed by a French-American architect for a group of French immigrant developers. Among other things, they were the developers of Normandy Estates. Choseno designed a lot of houses out there as well. And his offices were originally on the second floor of this building.
And Choseno was known, we kind of tapped old-timer architects in Denver, and Choseno, and we had discovered him for our book, Mid-Century Modern House in Denver for Historic Denver, but was a designer of luxury residences typically. And there is kind of a residential quality to this office building. And if you look closely, you can't really see it in the photo, there's a lot of Wrightian details, especially the exterior staircase on the back. This is Ambrose Williams Realty. This is one of the few storefronts that made our top tier list because it's really dominated by professional buildings. But there's a real intelligence to this building. Again, you have this parking lot detail which kind of takes away from our appreciation of the building because of how we feel about parking lots. But look at the textile laying of the blocks on the side, and the glass clear stories with the beams piercing the glass in the front, and that zigzag providing an overhang and a porch for the front of the buildings, but cantilevered, so there's no supports. This is right next door. This is a professional building. Notice the mixed use of the red lion sandstone and a dark, dark red brick. This is another Eugene Sternberg. This would have been after the courthouse building, but before the Miller building, and is still in the mood of the courthouse building. And notice the fancy brickwork on the two sides, where you have recessed lines, horizontal lines, but then the volume in the middle is a common bond. So it has this kind of sophisticated handling of the masonry. And the pseudo-symmetry of this front, where you have that raised edge. That would have been concrete.
It's just a facing material someone added to dress up the concrete, it's never a good idea to dress up concrete in a building where it was intended to be exposed. Nichols Hill Mortuary. Worth a walk inside the building. This stained glass here at the front of the chapel. Beautifully landscaped complex with parking to the rear, original signage that's particularly fine. And that's one thing that we haven't talked about, that we did talk about at Bemis, that part signage that was demolished as a result of a draconian sign ordinance that was adopted in the 70s. And And then this is one of the finest buildings, and Smedley Dental Clinic, the Smedley family, generations of Colorado dentists, the father of the current owner, approaching one of the most radical architects of the period to build this remarkable building that's in virtually original condition.
We walked through it.
Yeah, we walked through it the other day, and it's fantastic.
It looks like it was built at someone's workbench. You know, it's so hand done, the whole thing. And the owner is very sympathetic and loves the building, and his parents loved it. And it's a rare example of Hornbein's work down here. And you all may know Hornbein from the Denver Botanic Gardens, which is his most famous commission. This of course is 15 years older than the Botanic Gardens was.
And then the last Tier 1 building, United Bank of Littleton, in the context, Michael makes the point that the southwesternmost building and the northeasternmost building of the survey are the Barker Rinker Seacat on downtown, and then this building, and they really represent two completely different eras of construction. You're not working with a local firm, you're working with a national firm.
One thing that I thought was so interesting was, you know, the oil boom in Denver rewrote the Denver skyline, and the most famous architects in the world, you know, Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, Minoru Yamasaki, Gio Ponti, you know, came to Denver to build buildings, completely skipped Littleton Boulevard and Old Littleton, old downtown Littleton, because the growth from that period was south and west. That's when all that oil boom happened. And I think that's what saved a lot of these buildings, that it didn't boom in the 80s, which would have destroyed a lot of them. But this is kind of the new wave of what was brought in. A big-time LA firm does work for IBM and big banks in Los Angeles is hired by United Bank local family commissioning it, local construction companies. This is even the construction companies from Tulsa. You know, it's like this is the beginning of this kind of corporate national look to architecture that all the rest of the survey does not exemplify.
So those are the first tier buildings, and then I just wanted to show you a few things from the document itself so you can get an idea. These are the end papers that we've put together for the book that are all advertisements from West Littleton Boulevard businesses.
And it's really, just as an aside, it's really funny. Littleton was so small at this time, some of those ads do not have addresses. They have the name of the store and the phone number. And other ads, I don't know if it wound up on the end paper, will say, a block from the clock, or just south of Woodlawn, but no street address at all.
And it's interesting to look at how fast this transition took place between this old ranching and farming Littleton in this period. I was reading an account by a councilman of the period who was saying that was relating in the 70s, so when Woodlawn and some of these other commercial buildings were first built along this area, that you would see horses tied up, that people would be, ride on horseback from the nearby ranches and farms and would be shopping at these modern retail complexes. So,
sadly, we never found any photos of
that. So this is just a survey overview spread, just to give you an idea. This is kind of the corporate briefing that we talked about, and provides a little bit clearer scope of the survey, what we're calling here the greater West Littleton Boulevard, including West Main Street here, the downtown area, which appears in blue, and all of the buildings are marked in blue on the maps that show each of the 4 tiers. And then everything on Littleton Boulevard itself in red, and then this area on either side of it that are expressed in green. And this is an actual spread from the document. This is a spread that's going to appear in front of each of the 4 tiers of buildings, text describing exactly what the tier consists of, what's the quality of the buildings, the integrity of the buildings, the significance of the buildings from an architectural and historical standpoint.
So this is the one we just showed you.
Yeah.
So where all these dots are, this is the first tier.
And these are all of the map with now numbered, and basically. Then here's a sample spread of Tier 1. We're actually doing full-page spreads on all of the Tier 1 buildings, combining photographs of the buildings, historic images that we've been able to find connected with them, related buildings. This is a photograph of the Joshua House up at Hilltop that Michael talked about earlier. This is from a piece of ephemera from a title guarantee that I found at a flea market 10 years ago. And you'll have your basic information here, and then a very conversational kind of chat about the building. Here's some information about the architecture. Here's some information about the owner, the design of the building, the history of the building. Completely intended to be enjoyable to a general public.
And this is the material that will go in those survey forms, but delivered in a narrative. You know, instead of it just fill, line 67A, this is just turning the key elements of the building's story into a narrative.
Here's the Miller Law Offices showing the original rendering that Sternberg did, the original appearance of the fountain and the entryway into the building. Details of the casting of the brutalist walls with the raw concrete, the mark of the forms, and related buildings, an early rendering of Arapahoe County Community College and Heritage High School, and then Marty Miller when he was running for office.
That he ultimately won.
Yes. He was the youngest ever Arapahoe County District Attorney at the time he was elected. And then here, a similar spread for the Tier 1 Smedley. This is an original photograph of the building shortly after completion from the Hornbein Archives at the Denver Public Library.
And amazingly, the redwood walls have never been painted. They've been oiled every year.
By the family.
By the family.
Yeah.
They just completed it again. No stain, no paint. Yeah. Amazing.
And then, of course, his jewel box of Ross Broadway Library downtown. This is at Bayard between Lincoln and Broadway. And then, of course, a rendering of the entry, the education building, and the conservatory at the Botanic Garden. And then a great informal picture of Vic from his archive as well. And then we go from this full spread format on the first tier buildings, we go to this full page format for Tier 2 buildings. So here's the first Tier 2 spread that shows Laramie and Butts, which did Circle Savings and Loan downtown, altering the old church here at 2090 West Littleton. And that was for an insurance company office, again, a professional building. And then the Safeway store, which I'm not sure how many people are aware. That was actually the second Safeway store on the site. The first was one in the international style designed by a local architect who'd actually gone to school at Littleton High School. And then moving down, then this is the format that we're using for the Tier 3 and the Tier 4 buildings. The photos are getting smaller, not as much information available, less integrity, some not so great to start with, some heavily altered. This is the presentation of those, and this will have short text just aimed at a general audience that talks about some interesting feature of the building.
And the way we've divided it too is the original grant said that certain buildings had to be intensively surveyed and certain buildings should be subject to a reconnaissance survey. We looked at all the buildings and we decided which one should get intensive and which one should get in reconnaissance. So the 1 and 2, we're doing intensive because we think they're the most important. 3 and 4, we're doing the reconnaissance surveys because we don't think they're as important.
So that gives you an idea of the material that we're looking at, and then also the presentation that the final document's going to take. And I'd just like to start off kick off with an idea about public outreach that we began to discuss at this meeting, this tour we took of the Smedley Building. I don't know how familiar many of you are with that building, but it's still locally owned by the Smedley family. It's maintained in as an original condition as one can imagine of a building of that age, and it's rented at below market value to a very heartwarming nonprofit stroke recovery group. Remarkable group of people using the building for very good things, and the family basically holding that building as a tribute to the family and renting it, as I say, at below market rates in order to keep an important and contributing community member there.
Can I just throw in one sentence?
Yeah.
The Smedleys owned that whole corner, basically, from Botanic to,
Right.
not to Broadway, but to Acoma. And they carved out the Smedley property and have sold the rest of it. So 3 of the buildings that are on the rest of the property are Tier 2 buildings on our survey, but we believe they will be torn down in short order. But the Smedleys kept the clinic. They carved it out of the rest of the land because they are interested in saving.
So we met with Tom, and we met with the executive director and the board president of the Stroke Center. I wrote a little note based on our meeting with them and told them that I would be presenting this to you tonight as an idea for how we could approach some of this historic research. The Smedley Dental Clinic, evaluated as one of the finest buildings in the survey, has a sympathetic owner and tenant who are now working with the city and new adjacent owners to resolve parking and access for disabled clients in a manner that respects the historic building and the site. They are considering a possible new addition to better serve clients while preserving the integrity of the building and the site. There was originally an idea that they were going to fill in the front entry, and based on our discussion with them, they are no longer even considering that. And what we're trying to help them do is to organize, perhaps even pro bono, come up with an architect who might be willing to help, work more closely with the city with some of these parking and issues for the disabled bus that needs to work around that area, and to help them, do this in a right way. The tenant and the owner are both willing to consider serving as a public example of how voluntary historic preservation can enhance the overall value, prestige, and community support for significant survey buildings. And they are also soliciting any planning, design, construction, and financial assistance that might help them achieve these goals. So in Smedley, we've got a ready-made story that's interesting to the press, the history of the Smedley family, the Stroke Center, the work that they're doing, the support of the Littleton community for the Stroke Center. I mean, they've been telling us about nonprofit groups that the Elks have come to them and held fundraising events for the Stroke Center. Just all different ways of outreach, open house, building tour, all, would be a perfect exemplar of what this survey can mean in terms of identifying these buildings and then introducing them and showing the community their importance and how preservation can be managed. So we've got a ready-made group of people here, I think, to take on a really important thing. And I think that there's a number of other buildings, including the Miller Building, possibly including the Mr. Steak, possibly the FranCam Building, the Chosino Building. I think that we can expect that there's a number of sensitive owners and tenants that we could expect the same thing from. We've also been talking with the city about potential tours, walking tours, driving tours, and I've already pitched the idea to the Denver Architecture Foundation that does Doors Open Denver and does a lot of downtown things. They are going to consider moving out of downtown Denver in terms of offering tours, and I suggested this as a tour to them. And then I'm also in contact with a woman who just moved from Chicago that did a lot of walking tours for the Chicago Architectural Foundation, and I'm working on luring her down to maybe help us do some planning, tour planning connected with the survey too. So
maybe even historic Littleton. This was, I was saying this to you on doing Doors Open Littleton.
Yeah.
You know, on a Saturday, which you could combine the traditional historic buildings with the modernist historic buildings, and have people come in and look at these places. The stroke center, I was stunned at the condition of it, and it looks as though not Transamerica, the Title Building, that looks like it's in just beautiful condition too.
And that has a very sympathetic owner too. So, I mean, you could do an incredible open house grouping just of the professional buildings down there around the courthouse area, because they're really some of the finest buildings. And then, you know, do another thing that it would include Woodlawn, the Safeway, the IHOP, you know, get into the fast food and get into the retail. So, you know, we could definitely a series of themes that could be picked out for tours of
There's also a big car culture down here in Littleton. And one time when we were surveying, there was a huge car show behind Woodlawn, and you could barely move. And plugging in something like that, you know, to connect up with the buildings from the same era as the cars, and you find that the same people are interested in both kinds of things.
Great to have a video of all these antique cars from the 40s and 50s driving through the taco house.
Right,
and
yeah.
drive through. So that's our presentation.
It's wonderful, thank you. One of the things, I don't know if Andrew told you, is we met with HLI at our last meeting and just did a lot of brainstorming. And one of the things that came out of it was kind of a kickoff event. And I don't know if you do this presentation, if you get one of these property owners that we're willing to host, pass out the survey, invite the property owners and the community, but also the property owners to kind of talk about landmarking or what they can do to preserve their building. So has that something that you addressed?
You know, I would just, if I can throw something in here, that you were talking about the property owners, that district downtown in Denver, and that was Kathleen Brooker's idea. And what her idea was is, let's identify all these buildings, and then owners who want to be included can be. So the people who love their buildings joined this thing. The Brown Palace refused, and then the Brown Palace was embarrassed that all these other important buildings were on it, and so they became part of it too. So it could get a synergy of like, oh, you know, I'm not going to be left out, you know, if they're, you know, so that you kind of throw out a net and say, okay, who of you guys, which one of you are interested in being part of this overlay district? And then all of a sudden, maybe you have 12 of them, you know, to start. And without any kind of pressure on anybody, people who actually are already there, like maybe the owner of Mr. Steak, likely Drink Wine, they're very proud of their building.
Yeah.
Eduardo San at FranCam seemed very open. The Smedleys. So you might get this little cord just to start with, and that would cause people to want to.
I think that might be a good idea on this, Pam, is instead of doing a general call to all owners, that, we could see if we could on the side develop a group of friendlies that are willing to approach the other owners.
And when you talk about an overlay district, I heard this.
It just means non-contiguous buildings.
Okay.
Can you go back to your map, Diane, of Tier 1?
My technical skills.
It's funny it would land back on the Mountain States.
Well, one of the things too is that you've made all these great contacts, and there's going to come a time where you are going to move on to your next project, and this will be done. And how do we leverage that before you go on to your next project?
And that's why, I'm happy to work with you guys to identify a group of players and to help coordinate introductory things
I think
and
we
help
need
craft
that.
ideas and language. Colorado Preservation Inc., they've been showing up at every presentation and standing, Kim Grant stands up and says, how can we help? How can we help? So, if we do like a Doors Open Littleton with the city in cooperation with Historic Littleton and with you guys, and do a tour like that, I'm sure that Colorado Preservation Inc. would be delighted to jump on board with it and be involved.
And they were the ones that identified this as an endangered resource.
Which
What I was going to say is,
all
you could imagine that this is the overlay district. So it would be this building and this building, but not the ones in between. That's what the overlay refers to. That, see, the typical historic district, the buildings are adjacent to one another geographically. The overlay allows you to free yourselves from that geographic thing, which wouldn't work on West Littleton Boulevard because there's almost no block in which every building on the block would be notable.
So, Mike, would your overlay district then just be from the courthouse east, or would it include the downtown buildings?
I think you could go, one of the, and you guys are much more expert in this than we are, but we thought of that somehow the Main Street district could take in those Prince Street buildings, because all the five that we've identified are all on Prince Street, or at that intersection.
So I think the key would be that we need to do the paperwork to extend the period of significance of downtown.
So that there's another one that says 1950 to 1980. So then you get in these 60s and 70s buildings, 50s, 60s, and 70s buildings that we identified. And basically those are the only first-rate post-war buildings downtown. So the other ones we identified just don't clear the bar.
So they would join the downtown district as contributing buildings of a slightly different period, which would be included.
Okay.
Or you could go the overlay district route and link them to the West Littleton Boulevard building, so that the overlay wouldn't stop at the courthouse building, but would take in those other buildings that are downtown.
And
so it would be one of two ways you could do that.
And that decision may be based on preservation strategy, because you guys have built so many tools and have so much experience in the work that you've done downtown. So including those buildings may raise by expanding downtown to include modernism, that could be a model going eastward.
And then, so it would be, it would become part of the Main Street, a greater Main Street district, where that existing thing is expanded, and then would relate to the overlay on West Littleton Boulevard. And we've thought, although we haven't done the research to this, but if you were going to do this modernist overlay, and we're going to include downtown as part of that, you could then do something like Arapahoe Community College as part of the overlay. You know, you could go beyond the boundaries of our district.
Norgren.
Norgren, yeah.
Well, and we've had discussions about Alamo. That whole street and the buildings in between have been raised. That's important.
And that bank is right at the corner of Alamo and
I
Prince.
think it's very important that we get that list of property owners, which you've listed here, but, you know, maybe just an actual physical list of.
Well, those are actually historic names. Those were the original owner
Right.
and or tenant. But yeah, those, part of the survey form is that, and that's another thing that I'll mention, is this is going to be the first survey that's integrated with your GIS system in community planning. Okay, so we're working with Jackie so that you're now going to be able to go into the GIS system and click on one of these buildings, and the survey form will be attached to that. And I'm also going to attach PDFs of the articles that we found on it, PDFs of historic images that we found on it. Of course, that's not going to be true of every building because they don't exist for every building. But we're also trying to push and create a stronger bond between your building data system here and preservation in town.
One thing that came up in our meeting was we'd like a sense of the demographics of the owners and the tenants to help with our messaging and our marketing vehicles. Can you kind of speak to that?
I don't know what that means.
It's like age and who they are. If everybody's older, maybe social media isn't the way to go. If it's a mix, do events work? Should we send something through the mail? I mean, there's all different ways to do things, and we want to be as successful as possible in our awareness and whatever strategy we come up with.
I would bet it was a mix from the people that we've met. There's some older people, but there's some young people that have come in and bought the buildings. You know, also, and I'm not telling you guys anything, parts of this survey are in very rundown areas of West Littleton Boulevard. And some of the buildings are really distressed. So, which I think is an opportunity to save them because there isn't that economic pressure. It seems like just the West End and right at the South Broadway end is where everything's going on, and in between, it can actually be scary. You know, I came down here on Sundays to check buildings and stuff like that. It was actually scary in parts of, from about the 300 block west. It gets a little homeless people, that kind of thing, yeah.
Jumping the gun, but you're going to give the survey to each building owner, property owner? Is that?
Yes, that's.
And then is that mailed to them? Is it going to be part of an event, or have we gotten that far?
Well, we've discussed various ideas, at least on staff, and haven't come to a conclusion for anything, but one recent idea was just throwing it out that maybe it would be good to try to contact people individually and see if they could come in on a one-by-one basis, so we could really lay out the survey form.
Yeah, I think the biggest distinction you're going to find between owners is local owners versus out-of-state owners, let's say. I mean, even if they live in Denver, even if they live in Colorado, I think you've got some kind of tug on them as a resident of the state. But, you know, out-of-state ownership groups as opposed to individuals who, you know, I think that's going to be your big distinction. What you're going to get from the GIS is just going to be the owner data coming out of the county system. That's where we're drawing that data from. So it'll be names and addresses and so forth. But on a lot of those, you can't tell whether a corporate name is actually a single individual, some guy who lives in Littleton who bought the building, or whether it's, you know, 150 people living in California with a joint investment kind of thing. So that's why we had talked about, gee, the best way is to do a one-on-one kind of thing. I mean, there's a possibility of doing a mail survey with the owners, but I think they're going to feel targeted and uncomfortable with that. And that's why we started with the idea of coming up with the friendlies and have owners talking with owners and having them talk one-on-one with the city and members of Historic Littleton and so forth, you know, to really push a very friendly kind of community-based approach to meeting them and getting to know who they are, as opposed to I think the kind of information you're looking for would be too intrusive for most owners to provide in a written survey.
When you talked about, so you're going to submit this survey, when is it due, summer? It's going to be finalized? And then how long do you stay involved, or then at that point do you move on? In other words, how long do we have you as a resource as part of this project?
To the end of this meeting.
That's not the answer we wanted.
I would say,
We talked about, Jocelyn and I have talked with Michael and Diane about outreach efforts that go beyond the scope of this survey as it was originally imagined.
Oh, so they would stay involved in some sort of
we
consulting?
might stay
right?
involved with it. We may bring in other people, to put them forward. We're interested in working on the project conceptually, but without doing any of the real work. That's our professional goal in any ongoing assistance that we give you.
Well, I have a question about, we had talked about demographics for a campaign.
Yes.
And I am looking at a list of buildings that we're talking about. That's a small list. That's personal contact.
Go
and
for tier
communication. We
one.
don't need
Tier one is,
demographics. Yeah. I mean, we need to have,
Young
we
people
can
love
build
this
these
period
relationships.
too. This
Yes.
period is very big with millennials, the mid-century modern thing, and it could be somehow geared to, have a party or an event.
Exactly.
Or,
I mean, your ideas are fantastic of, kind of cultivating the group of friendlies, the influence leaders among these people, and forming relationships, having, the kind of event where we can, because this is exciting. This survey is an exciting thing. And to roll it out and have a little event or party would be really, I think, very powerful. And as I recall, leaving the library when people saw the presentation from the community, I mean, there was so much energy and excitement coming out of that library. People were really jazzed about this.
Oh, I was stunned too, because I think when I was going, I was thinking, okay, we're going to get 6 70-year-old ladies, and it's going to be me and Diane and Andrea, and instead it was jam-packed, and people with memories and everything. I was delighted by that.
The thing about an event, we're all excited about this. We all think it's a great idea. But if we had an event, and there was some property owners, not these small group of friendlies, but maybe some other people that don't understand historic preservation, feel like they are, how do I say it, that this is being put upon them and they don't want to participate, then could that influence things in a negative way in a group environment that we might not have in a one-on-one? I just toss it out to the group.
Maybe the one-on-one is a good idea ahead of this. Then you would know who was a friendly, and then maybe get the Millers or someplace where there's actually a room or room enough that you could have an event and have a small event.
Yeah. And I would say to play it from the social side. And that's why we don't think it's really important that we be involved doing a presentation like the one we've given you. This is still, even at this, it's a technical presentation. They're not interested in talking about the rhythm of the fenestration and how far the eaves are overhanging and this kind of thing. So I think the best approach was really to set it up as a fun social thing and virtually ignore all of the preservation issues, to keep that with your friendly taste leader group and have them doing that, underground, but that all of the events and the public thing. One of the thoughts I've had is William Logan, who's the editor of Modern in Denver, is a great friend. And I walked up to him a few weeks ago and said, hey, I want you to do an article on brutalism in Littleton. He said, fantastic, I've just been thinking about doing an article. And I said, it's the best in Littleton. We need to sit down and take a look at it. And one of his big things as a magazine, he's very active on social media, And he's huge on organizing these hugely popular design events that reach out through the architecture and design community throughout the whole metro area. You know, he's doing Design Week Denver, a whole week-long thing of events that takes place normally, I think, in July. One of the tours could be associated with that. So instead of it being an insular discussion between owners of buildings on Littleton Boulevard, that you're drawing this whole regional audience who are already crazy and interested in this material, and so that everybody's just, wow, there's a lot of people that are excited about this. You know, to take that approach.
You know, one of the things that I've been thinking about is, you know, Littleton, we know our identity as, you know, a farm town and a Denver suburb. And that's how we sprung up. And there are several of those in the metro area, ringing Denver. And the fact that we do have this concentration of very interesting and significant modern architecture and brutalism, and just kind of this whole space age, you know, look at this particular piece of our history is one more page in that makes Littleton interesting. And I think that differentiates Littleton from all of the other, you know, Denver little farm towns that sprung up as suburbs of Denver.
Well, the third element in that identity is Martin Marietta. And this whole combine of Marathon Oil, Ohio, originally Ohio Oil, and, you know, that you had a world-class group of it wasn't just a suburb. I mean, like Englewood in a lot of ways is a suburb too. It stayed a blue-collar town. You guys had a level of professional expertise on an international level, constantly moving through this community. They were the tastemakers. They were looking at architecture. They were building this community. And that's something that all of these other farm town turned to suburbs did not have.
Exactly right. I mean, it's like new frontier.
Right.
You know, Diane and I did a very similar survey for Boulder. And, you know, it makes sense that important architects would work in Boulder because there was the university there. Martin Marietta and Norgren and what have you stood in for the university here. So you have that same kind of super sophisticated modernist architecture that ordinary people wouldn't have supported, but that there was the intellectual community here that knew what it was, that supported it, that expected it. You know, so you have these little insurance companies and banks and just really stepping up to make something of national class.
In the terms of modern architecture, Littleton is much more like Boulder than Wheat Ridge, than Lakewood, any of the other towns that you would kind of think would be in that same category. And it's because of that whole space age. I mean, you were cutting edge computer technology, cutting edge space technology, weaponry technology, you know, just an incredible group of things. And that's what sets this apart. We need to amp up the space age stuff in the country.
It seems like...
Except that the state objected to that. And that's why we put it down. Because there were no direct space age connections with the street.
Well, there are, though, because there were businesses, industrial businesses that were here because of Martin Marietta and because of Ohio Oil, were moving into some of these smaller office buildings on Littleton Boulevard.
If we stretch the
documentation of that.
If we stretch the overlay district, though, to include Norgren, then there would be that whole
Yes.
a space high-tech context.
Seminole industrial / office parks. Martin Marietta falls into that category, and And Norgren is a little jewel box local example of exactly that same thing that sits right
Off the edge
West
of
Littleton
West
Boulevard.
Littleton Boulevard corridor,
It seems to me it's going to be quite the challenge, come up with a plan and pull these various groups together, HPB, HLI, the consultants, Colorado Preservation, Inc., that we all get going in the same direction and we're all leveraged appropriately so that, one, we don't duplicate, two, that it doesn't fall apart. Oh, the survey was nice, it's lovely, this is a great area, bye-bye, we're on to something else. So I guess staff is going to take that lead in creating a plan, right?
Together with HPP.
So we're participate. So when do we do that? Do we wait until July? Do we start that process now?
Start now.
Yes.
Do we take a portion of our meeting? Do we put it on pencil and paper? I mean,
What about a working group? To set up a working group where there's one or two members from you,
That's a good
Historic
idea.
Littleton, we can advise, and set up an
I
email
like that.
thing,
Yeah.
and get Modern in Denver on it. Get this woman who might be interested in doing your tours on it. Put together a working subgroup.
That would be, that's an excellent idea.
It would be great, I think, too, just as an organizing thing, and maybe Littleton History Museum, the Littleton Museum would do it, is a photo show of the top tier, with informational wall copy about each of these. We could just pull what we're saying off those pages, and so that somebody could actually walk through. One of the things that I think is so interesting about the PowerPoint is seeing these buildings next door to one another, in our mind's eye, that we're looking at this whole area, but we're seeing them one after another as we go from downtown to Broadway. And so that helps people clarify things. So if you had an exhibit, or the Bemis Library, I'm sure, has an exhibition space, something like that, where even using our photographs, having them printed up rather than hiring, a photographer, which can be very expensive.
Or having artistic, fine art photographers
That
take
would
on the
be
buildings.
great.
We did a project like that years ago downtown. Remember when the Peyton Gallery did a call for photographers and artists to come up with artwork and photographs of modern buildings in Denver, and they were given a list of buildings to work with. And then they put together that was something that was quasi-documentation and quasi-art, that kind of pushed all of the boundaries. And then, these kinds of things I've collected, like every piece of ephemera that we've been able to find on the building and things like that. So those things would be available too.
I love the idea of a working group with these various interests involved. And I mean, we can definitely contribute to that or bounce ideas off in preservation, but I think it's a bigger group of people. We can only have 2 people from our group, and I don't know if anybody is interested. We're losing a couple of our members. Some people are kind of tapped out on projects like
Part of a working group, I would love that.
Okay, Kim, is there anybody else?
I would.
There we go.
Okay. One of the things, and Michael, you pointed this out, and it's no secret that this Littleton corridor runs through a section of Littleton that has its challenges. And I think that, especially, looping Norgren in, this can be something that can, build a little bit of pride in that neighborhood as well.
I just think it's important to have an overall plan and something that can be implemented within the level of our resources. We can't come up with 20 things and expect it all to happen. Somehow we roll it out or whatever, but that would be great.
Yeah, I think we definitely need to have a focal point. I think what we want to be diverse in is reaching out to different players who can bring different skills and different levels of publicity. People have different levels of social media ability, and like Modern in Denver is great about that. They send out this weekly email magazine that's just as great as the printed magazine they do once a month. And so, and Colorado Preservation Inc., they're hooked into the whole preservation community. They can say, oh, let's pull Historic Denver in on this. Let's pull this other preservation group in. So if we get a group of players, that have publicity is their number one reason for being there. Workshop organizing or event organizing is their main reason for being there. Rootedness in the community, knowledge of the community planning process, because we do want to bring this down to a level where the city's actually working with these people. So people down at Smedley are wondering, how can we get this turnaround, because they're changing the street alignment now that all these other people are buying these other buildings, and all of a sudden we don't know where our van's going to turn around, and our disabled patrons don't know where they're parking. We want to be able to, that the city's going to be helping them handle brass tax stuff like that, the real down and dirty side of preservation, at the same time that, we're doing this. Oh, isn't this exciting? Isn't this fun? So everybody gets excited and involved.
I have to say one thing. In order, in terms of the working group, one thing you guys have to conceive of is there has to be an event, because Modern in Denver is not going to write about a non-event. That you're not going to, there has to be some kind of event that the media can hook onto. Because we're beyond the days when there was enough room in the newspapers to write a thing about how Littleton is putting together a working group. That's just never going to get any publicity. But if there was that's why I suggested an exhibit. You could have like an open to the public kind of event where I could even imagine you could have a digital projection with the buildings, passing by, some kind of thing. Diane organized the thing at the Old Key Savings, the Charles Deaton, and that was a success beyond anyone's imagination.
That was insanely and unbelievably popular.
And what was it, a photo exhibit?
It's a 50th birthday party for the Flying Saucer Bank at Englewood and Hampton up there.
So there was a show at the Museum of Outdoor Arts, which is right there, that had pictures. Look, the people who had originally commissioned the bank had a bank-shaped cake, at the grand opening. It was like outrageous. And so Diane arranged with the bank that they would have one day where people could come into the bank. And I talked to somebody at the bank, and they said there was no period in which there weren't at least 75 people in the bank during like a 10-hour run. And when I got there for the reception. There were hundreds of people there. You couldn't park within blocks. That is a spectacular bank, and it does have the association with the Flying Saucer House. But, the Marlowe is pretty sensational. The whole brutalism is a real hot topic right now in terms of social media. There's whole brutalist websites.
Well, it sounds like there's a lot of exciting possibilities and go beyond just Denver. So, Andrea, is that something that you want to spearhead a meeting and make sure that Kim and Jolene are involved, along with the other people we talked about? We can have Gail see who wants to represent HLI, maybe Littleton Museum. I don't know. You'll know the
I'll work
players.
on it with my city people and
Staff.
with staff,
And
we'll start putting it all together.
And I'll start feeding you who I think regional contacts, metro area contacts would be, where you're coming from the community side, who are the people in Littleton we need to be bringing in, and I'll be talking to people about who from the outside designer architecture community can we bring in from the outside to help influence our outcome here.
That's wonderful. Anything else? It's been great. I would like to hear more, but I think we've got a good starting point.
I think so.
Thank you. This has been
Oh,
fabulous.
sure.
Wonderful.
It's been
This is
fun.
wonderful. Fabulous. Do we want to, and do we want to shift over to some kind of internal business and reports that you have before we adjourn. And if you don't want to stay, you don't have to. If you want to, you're welcome. We'll just
Okay.
have some administrative stuff.
It's been great.
We get it, we get it.
I hope you guys enjoy it.
Yes.
Okay.
I have a card. Do you
Yeah,
have one?
great.
And I'll email you all my contact information.
What are the odds that I actually have one with me?
I'm like, I don't have any.
Well, clearly you're doing better than I am. I'm getting ready to retire, so
What?
I've given up printing cards.
Yes.
How do I do this media eject?
Interesting.
Yeah, how do I eject this USB drive?
Click on it. Right click on it.
Do we want to take a 5-minute break and
And then we'll
kind of transition? Why don't we do that? Why don't we just take a 5-minute break and then we'll come back together and just finish up with the little stuff we have to do.
We have an 8:30 call. About the next few HPB meetings, because we do have 2 extra meetings coming up in April. So the first meeting, your regular meeting, will be Monday, April the 16th, and that is where the 2 new HP board members will attend their first meeting, and there will be elections that the board will do for your chair and vice chair. And then we're looking at the possibility of having the city attorney's office come in to do some legal training. And we did have it somewhat recently here, but with the new board members coming on, we thought it might be a good opportunity to do that. And we have no public hearings coming up in April.
Does that overlap with the board and commissions training that they're having in April for all?
It'll be there. It doesn't overlap. So you mean in terms of material? Yeah. So it'll be different actually. It'll probably be Lena who would come, and she would give a different presentation directed specifically to the Historical Preservation Board. Okay, and then the next meeting will be that same week on Friday. That is the council breakfast meeting with the HPB. And Pam has been working with the mayor on the agenda for that.
And do you want me to tell you now what we got so far?
Oh, sure.
This is what Debbie came up with. This is going to be an extremely short meeting, okay? And we've got, when Debbie and I were talking about the agenda, we're going to start at 7:30 and have 20 minutes of eating. And normally they start at the formal meeting at 8, but we're going to start a little bit early. And she is welcoming the introductions. And then she's going to talk about the comp plan and their vision and how HPV fits into that. And that's real important. My guess is that could go to 8:15, 8:20. Then the things that we wanted to put on the calendar was, on the agenda, was a all-inclusive district and maybe a little bit about signage. What we've uncovered is that if council will give us half the money, we could get a grant for the other half next year and put a sign up in Vega Park, which we've talked about. So that was, all we need them is to say, yes, we would consider it in the budget, and then we can move forward getting a bid. I don't know if Littleton Corridor would come up. That will probably be it. And for those of you that have been in council meetings, council can ask a lot of questions. They can kind of take one topic and really kind of want to chat about it. So if other things come up like Littleton Corridor, I mean, basically we can say we have a working group, whatever, this is the plan. So that's what we've got to do. And so it'll be very discussion oriented, no PowerPoint. Mike and I will put together something on the historic district. I don't know who's going to take over signage. If anybody's interested, that would be wonderful. If not, we may rely on some of the new people. I don't know what. We don't have to apply for the grant until next year, but we just have to get kind of a nod from. It's a conceptual sale at this point. We don't have to be real specific. And then there's a plan. Keep going.
Okay, so that breakfast meeting again is on Friday the 20th, and it begins at 7:30 a.m. in this meeting.
Here.
This room, yes. Okay, and then the third April meeting will be on Monday the 23rd. That's 1 week following your regular meeting. And that is going to be a joint meeting between the Planning Commission and the HPB. And there will be discussion on the downtown design standards and guidelines update. You'll have an opportunity to learn about what we've been working on with that and give your input.
And that is in this building?
It'll be in this building. I'm going to send out an email
And 6:30 now.
Yeah, 6:30 to capture all of these meetings too. So.
What was that last date? Sorry, 16th.
This is the 23rd. That's the downtown design guidelines.
Anything else?
That's it.
Okay, a couple quick updates. Next week, Mike and we talked about tonight, just so you know that's happening. We're meeting at 4 o'clock next week. We need somebody to take over the sign project. Oh, the art. Going to step up to the plate and lead that. I don't know if it's going to be Art Walk or First Friday or what it's going to look like, but so we're still on for the tours, and Margie and HLI are going to be, Margie specifically is going to rework the signage, so I told her we probably need one question to the group. Again, we're in the midst of change. Western Welcome. Remember, we have a booth. Mike's going to put in a request for our booth. And I was wondering, will we have enough people to man the booth? Maybe some of you know you're going to be on vacation. If everybody's gone on vacation, because one year we had like half of the board was gone on vacation, and we can't cover like 2 hours worth of shifts, and I've already reserved the tent, so somehow we'll have to figure all that logistics out, but that's already been reserved. I've done that. Mike's, okay, just let you know. And then I have to sadly say, we're losing two of our board members. One is Dan Miller, who's just been a great asset to our board, and we're going to miss him desperately. He was vice chair. He's really stepped up to the plate, a great volunteer. But the city still gets him because he's going over to Planning Commission.
Great.
And then Ted, who couldn't be here tonight, is going to be rolling off the board, and he's not going to renew it. We're all set to renew and everything.
Right.
Yeah, we get David back. We haven't lost him, so.
Do we know who our new members are? Is it on the website yet?
I looked the other day, but I didn't see
It
it.
is. If you look in the city council, March 6th, something like that, their regular meeting, it's in the agenda.
The names of the people?
Yeah.
Thank you. Anything else that anybody wants to bring up? I think I mentioned everything. Okay, thank you very much. Good, we made your.
Thank you
Yes,
so much.
yes. I didn't want to cut too short, but I also didn't want to keep everybody, while we had talked, so maybe we can talk to them. So,
Bloody has been,
yes.
I see you guys are at the 23rd, it sounds like we're having it.
Feel like you never left.
Yes.
You can pepper us.
Wow.
Next meeting about the sites.
Oh, if you want to say, I don't think it'd be terribly difficult,
I don't think so, I think.
but it would be getting a bid